Steve Rose, who knows everybody who ever went to Simpson College. And not only does he know them, he has an anecdote about it, I swear. He's been teaching there for 20 years, and he's also a poet and has had pieces published in many, many magazines. Steve Rose.
The other morning, I lay in bed as my wife of now over 15 years sat on its edge, preparing to go to work. Her beautiful thin shoulder blades pressed against a beige t-shirt, thin pink line of panties protruded above her pajamas. She was beautiful. And I wanted to tell her that, but she doesn't like to be told she's beautiful. So I watched, and I enjoyed. There was a time when I wasn't like that. Late last century, I lost a marriage of nearly 20 years. I love my wife, I love my children. But there's always a marathon to run, a tennis tournament to play in, a paper to write. Something else, some mountain to climb. And she was gone. Well, after a few months, I decided I needed to get back in circulation. And I talked to a friend of mine named Steve MacArthur, who was a New Testament theologian, and he told me about a dating site. And he had met the woman who would eventually become his wife there, and I thought, well, if it works for Steve the Holy, it might work for Steve the Secular. So I got online, and I found out that a middle-aged college professor without too many bad habits can attract some females in the Des Moines area. But nothing particularly worked. Nice ladies, but it wasn't there. And right about this time of the year, in 2000, right around Valentine's Day, I got an email from this Mary Jones, this Chicago woman, big city lady, artist, art professor, and we started writing back and forth, and back and forth. And I found myself sitting at the computer waiting to get a message from Mary so I could type back. Me waiting, not doing something, not like me. Well, we went from typing to talking. My landline bill was astronomical. And we'd spend hours on the phone. And at one point I finally asked her, I said, well, what made you think this was worth pursuing? And she said, in total honesty, you can punctuate. Well, we made plans to meet. But first of all, I had to attend a conference in New Orleans, which, by the way, is where I got this hat. And upon my return, my father had another heart attack. My father lived where I grew up in North Platte, Nebraska. And so I drove that 400 miles to North Platte along my beloved Platte River. And by the way, on our honeymoon, Mary and I stopped at the Platte River and we skinny dipped, but that's another story. And as I traveled along, I saw the last of the migratory birds. I saw the cottonwood starting to bud out. I'm cataloging these things to tell Miss Mary Jones. And so I get to North Platte, I put myself into the Blue Spruce Motel, fine establishment, get out my cell, and we talk. I'm visiting my father. And I don't get along with my stepmother, so besides the time I spend with my father, I spend it in the Blue Spruce, or walking the Platte. And normally I'd be wanting to fish or do something, but it was just enough to be there for a change. And another thing happened. My father and I talked like we hadn't talked in years. He told me about his childhood. He told me about my childhood. He told me about his time in World War II and his biggest regret. His biggest regret was he never got a tattoo. He was afraid he'd come back, he wouldn't like it. And so I got on the phone with Mary Jones. And I said, I want a tattoo. And when I returned to North Platte, there it was in the mail. Beautiful Celtic cross with a rose protruding from it. And so on my right shoulder, I had the art of an artist who I'd never met. Well, my father passed. And Mary and I talked and made plans to meet in Muscatine, Iowa, roughly equidistant between Chicago and Indianola. And I waited for her in the Holiday Inn. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. Brad Paisley had not coined the song Waiting on a Woman at this point in time, but I would have been humming it. And then she came through the door, this beautiful woman. Denim skirt, peasant blouse, beautiful feet with toes hanging out of her sandals, hair flying, and we saw each other. And I don't really remember what happened quite then. I know we went up to our room, we sat on separate beds, we listened to some Cowboy Junkies, we listened to some Indigo Girls, two people in the youth of their middle age rocking out. And we told stories. And then we didn't talk. It was a beautiful night. The next morning, we got up and we decided to explore Muscatine. Mary is an expert on architecture. And so as we walked through that riverfront town, she talked about all these buildings that predated the Great War, this Victorian place, this Foursquare, this bungalow. These are terms I'd heard, but me, a house was a house, where you hung your hat, stacked your books, kept your tennis racket dry. But I was learning to listen and to like. Well, this pattern continued. We met up in Clinton, Iowa, and made a day trip to Washington, where she'd spent several years as a child, where her father had been the hospital administrator. And we walked around those grounds, hospital now, deserted, and she talked about the patients and the doctors and the nurses and her sister and her plane. That whole area started to breathe. And I realized that home and hearth can be alive as the people in it. And then a couple weeks later, we went to Savannah, Illinois. Checked into a room which I will remember forever, simply because it smelled more like fish than the river. And so we did a lot of walking. We walked along this tributary of the Mississippi, along these docks, and coming down with the current was this flotilla of little white paper boats with candles lit sticking up in them. Origami. And as they floated by in that dusk, and they lit in her eyes, I turned to her, and I'm not much of a smoocher, but that was one hell of a kiss. Found out later that this was kind of a harbinger of our marriage, that this flotilla was something that you release after a couple is wed as a celebration. Well, summer came, and I decided to visit her in Chicago. Now, I am a country boy. I still think driving in Des Moines is dangerous. And so here I am, hearing her directions in my head, getting on 55, getting on Lakeshore, getting on Devon, finally on Albion, and I parked in front of her four-flat, and I hear her voice. Mary has a voice that could calm a frightened puppy, and I felt like that puppy, only I felt like I'd come home. I had a place to be. We had a wonderful evening. The next day, we went to an art opening at Robert Morris College where she taught, and it was a student show. And we went in the space, and again, Mary was dressed beautifully in burgundy and pink and a skirt and makeup on that you couldn't tell she put on, and she was surrounded by her students. Now, I'm a teacher too, and I admired that. But I also found out something about myself. Normally, I like to be the center of attention. Otherwise, why would I be here? But it was enough to watch Mary among those people, to admire her. You see, one of the things you find about falling out in love is not just the person that you admire, but a person you find inside yourself that you also admire. I kind of like this Steve guy. Observant, sometimes quiet, sometimes just a support. Well, later that afternoon, we walked down Michigan Avenue, and Mary was pointing out the sights, and I'm gawking around like the rube that I am. As we approached this cafe, there's this wizened, middle-aged black man, about the age I am now. And as we got closer, he stood up, he looked at me and said, "Great hat, man. Beautiful woman." Well, you know it still is. 7th row back, near the aisle, she still is.